The handcuffs clicked shut around my pregnant wife's wrists as snow fell on her trembling shoulders. She was 8 months pregnant, in labor, and these fake cops with their counterfeit badges were treating her like a criminal in the middle of the worst blizzard our town had seen in decades. "Sir, you need to step back," one of them barked at me, his plastic badge catching the streetlight. He had no idea who he was talking to. No idea that I spend my days briefing senators and coordinating with foreign intelligence agencies. No idea that I am the director of Homeland Security for the entire northeastern region. But they were about to find out. As my wife's breathing became more labored and the contractions grew stronger, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to teach these suburban wannabes what real authority looks like, and it was going to be a lesson they would never forget. My name is Michael Harrison, and for the past 5 years I have lived a double life. By day, I am one of the most powerful men in federal law enforcement. I oversee security operations that protect millions of Americans. I brief cabinet members and coordinate with intelligence agencies across the globe. By night, I am just Mike from Maple Street, a quiet neighbor who waves at the mailman and keeps his lawn perfectly trimmed. I chose this anonymity deliberately. When you hold a position like mine, keeping your family safe means keeping your identity hidden. My neighbors knew me as a government contractor who traveled frequently for work. They had no idea that I could mobilize federal agents with a single phone call. The blizzard started on a Tuesday evening in February. The Weather Service called it a historic storm, the kind that happens once every 50 years. 3 feet of snow was predicted, with winds strong enough to knock down power lines and make roads impassable. By 8 o'clock, our suburban neighborhood looked like a frozen wasteland. My wife Sarah was in her 8th month of pregnancy with our first child. She had been feeling anxious all day, packing around our living room and complaining about unusual pressure in her lower back. I tried to calm her nerves, but the howling wind outside made everything feel more intense. "Mike, something is wrong," she said, gripping the arm of our couch. Her face was pale and her breathing was shallow. "These are not normal pains." I felt my stomach drop. Sarah had been through enough pregnancy books to know the difference between normal discomfort and something serious. When she looked at me with fear in her eyes, I knew we had to act fast. "We need to get to the hospital," I said, already reaching for my keys. "Right now." The drive to the medical center normally took 15 minutes. In this weather, it could take an hour or more, but we had no choice. Sarah's contractions were getting stronger and more frequent. Our baby was coming early, and we needed professional medical help. I helped Sarah into our SUV, wrapping her in blankets and adjusting the heat to maximum. The roads were barely visible under the snow, but I had driven in worse conditions during my federal training. I knew how to handle emergencies. What I did not know was that our HOA had recently created something called a neighborhood security patrol. These were residents who had bought police equipment online and decided to play cop during the storm. They wore uniforms that looked official from a distance and carried badges that gleamed like real police credentials. We made it 3 blocks before I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A white SUV with security, written on the side, was following us, its red and blue lights cutting through the snow like a fake police cruiser. I pulled over, thinking they might be offering assistance. That was my first mistake. 2 men in dark uniforms approached our vehicle. They looked like police officers, but something felt wrong. Their posture was too casual, their movements too uncertain. Real cops move with purpose and authority. These men moved like they were playing a role. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle," the taller one said. His badge read Officer Martinez, but his voice lacked the confidence of someone with real training. "My wife is in labor," I said through the rolled-down window. "We need to get to the hospital immediately." "We need to check your identification and registration first," the second man said. His badge said Officer Thompson. Neither name meant anything to me, and I knew every law enforcement officer in our county. That was when I realized these were not real cops. These were neighbors playing dress-up with fake badges and counterfeit authority, and they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. "Officers, I understand you are trying to help, but this is a medical emergency," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. My federal training had taught me to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. These men were clearly not law enforcement, but I needed to handle this carefully. Sarah was breathing heavily in the passenger seat, her contractions coming every few minutes now. Each wave of pain made her grip the door handle tighter, and I could see the fear in her eyes growing stronger. "Sir, we have reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood," Officer Martinez said, pulling out a small notebook that looked like it came from a dollar store. "We need to verify your identity and your reason for being out during the storm advisory." I stared at him in disbelief. A storm advisory was not a legal reason to detain citizens. These men had no authority to stop us, no training to handle emergencies, and no understanding of the law they were pretending to enforce. "I live at 432 Maple Street," I said, showing them my driver's license. "This is my wife Sarah, and she is in active labor. We need to get to St. Mary's Hospital immediately." Officer Thompson took my license and walked back to their vehicle, speaking into a radio that was probably connected to nothing. I watched him in the side mirror, noting how he held the radio like someone who had seen it done in movies, but had never actually used proper police equipment. While he was gone, I took a closer look at Martinez. His uniform was store-bought, the kind you could order online for $50. His badge was plastic with a cheap metal coating that was already showing wear marks. His duty belt held a flashlight, handcuffs, and what looked like pepper spray, but everything was positioned wrong. A real officer would never carry equipment so carelessly. "Where did you get your training?" I asked him, genuinely curious about how far this charade went. "We completed a comprehensive security course," he said, puffing out his chest. "The HOA board approved our patrol unit to keep the neighborhood safe during emergencies like this." The HOA board. Now it was starting to make sense. Our homeowners association had been growing more aggressive over the past year, sending violation notices for minor infractions and threatening fines for things like leaving garbage cans out too long. Creating a fake police force was exactly the kind of overreach I would expect from them. Thompson returned with my license and a clipboard full of forms. "Sir, we need you to fill out this incident report and provide proof of your destination." Proof of my destination. I could not believe what I was hearing. "My wife is having a baby. That is all the proof you need." Sarah moaned in pain, doubling over as another contraction hit. The sound cut through the cold air like a knife, and I saw both fake officers step back uncomfortably. They were clearly not prepared to handle a medical emergency. "Ma'am, we need you to remain calm," Martinez said, approaching the passenger side window. "We have medical training and can assist you if necessary." "What kind of medical training?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We completed a basic first aid course," Thompson said proudly. "We know how to handle emergency situations." A basic first aid course. These men thought they could deliver a baby in the middle of a blizzard, because they had watched a few videos and gotten certificates from some online program. My phone buzzed with a text message from my deputy director. Storm causing security issues at federal facilities. May need you on call tonight. The irony was not lost on me. I was responsible for protecting federal installations across 6 states, but I could not protect my own wife from suburban vigilantes with fake badges. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of revealing my position and ending this charade immediately, I chose to maintain my cover. I thought I could handle the situation without exposing my identity. I thought these men would eventually see reason and let us pass. I was wrong. Look, we will fill out whatever forms you need, but we have to do it at the hospital, I said, trying to find a compromise. My wife cannot wait any longer. Martinez and Thompson exchanged glances, then walked back to their vehicle for another conference. I watched them argue for several minutes while Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate. When they returned, their attitudes had changed. They were no longer pretending to be helpful. They were asserting their authority with the confidence of people who had been given permission to do whatever they wanted. "Sir, you and your wife need to exit the vehicle," Martinez said, his hand resting on his pepper spray. "We have reason to believe you are not being truthful about your emergency." That was when I knew this situation was about to get much worse. "You want my pregnant wife to get out of the car in a blizzard." I could not hide the disbelief in my voice anymore. "Are you completely insane?" "Sir, we need to search your vehicle for evidence of illegal activity," Thompson said, pulling out his handcuffs. "Your story about the hospital does not match the reports we received." "What reports?" I demanded. "Reports from who?" "That is confidential information," Martinez replied, moving to the passenger side of our SUV. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle slowly." Sarah looked at me with terror in her eyes. Another contraction was building, and she was barely able to speak between the waves of pain. "Mike, please do not let them do this." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to reveal my identity and end this nightmare. I could have my federal credentials out in seconds and have these men arrested within the hour. But doing so would expose my position to the entire neighborhood, potentially putting my family at risk from real threats. I made another calculation. I would comply temporarily, document everything, and then destroy these men through proper legal channels. It would take longer, but it would be more thorough. "Sarah, we are going to do what they say," I told her, squeezing her hand. "Just stay calm and let me handle this." She nodded, trusting me despite the fear in her eyes. I helped her out of the vehicle, supporting her weight as she stood on shaking legs. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind cut through our clothes like ice water. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Martinez commanded, his fake authority growing bolder with each passing moment. I complied, mentally noting the badge number on his uniform and the exact time on my watch. Everything they were doing was illegal. Every action they took was adding years to their eventual prison sentences. Thompson began searching our SUV while Martinez kept watch over us. Sarah had another contraction and cried out in pain, bending forward and gripping my arm for support. "She needs medical attention," I said firmly. "This is dangerous for both her and the baby." "We will determine what is dangerous," Martinez replied. "Right now, you both are suspected of violating the neighborhood emergency protocols." Neighborhood emergency protocols. They were making up laws as they went along, creating authority that did not exist and enforcing rules that had no legal basis. In my professional capacity, I had seen corrupt officials in foreign countries behave exactly the same way. "Found something," Thompson called out from inside our SUV. He was holding Sarah's overnight bag, the one we had packed weeks ago for the hospital. "This bag contains suspicious items." Suspicious items. He was talking about baby clothes, diapers, and medical supplies. The delusion was so complete that I almost laughed, but Sarah's worsening condition kept me focused. A black sedan pulled up behind the fake police cruiser, and I recognized the driver immediately. It was Harold Brennan, the HOA president and the most despised man in our neighborhood. He stepped out of his car wearing a heavy coat and a smug expression. "Officers, what is the situation here?" he asked, walking over to us with the confidence of someone who believed he was in charge. "We have two individuals violating the emergency travel ban," Martinez reported. "They claim to be going to the hospital, but their vehicle contains suspicious materials." Harold looked at Sarah, who was now leaning against our SUV and breathing heavily. Even he could see that she was clearly in labor, but his expression showed no sympathy. "The hospital story is probably false," he said, nodding approvingly. "People will say anything to avoid following the rules." That was the moment I truly understood what we were dealing with. This was not just incompetence or overzealousness. This was a deliberate abuse of power by people who enjoyed inflicting suffering on others. Other neighbors had started to appear at their windows, watching the scene unfold from the safety of their warm homes. I could see faces behind the glass, people who could help but chose not to get involved. They were all complicit in what was happening. "Sir, we are going to need you to place your hands behind your back," Thompson said, approaching me with handcuffs. "You cannot be serious," I said, but I could see from his expression that he was completely serious. The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists, the metal cold against my skin. I had been in handcuffs before during training exercises, but this was different. This was real, and it was happening because of fake cops with fake authority. "Now the woman," Harold said, pointing at Sarah. "She is pregnant and in labor," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You cannot handcuff a woman in active labor." "We can and we will," Martinez said, moving towards Sarah with his own set of handcuffs. "She is equally responsible for violating the emergency protocols." Sarah looked at me with desperation as Martinez grabbed her arm. "Mike, please help me." I watched in horror as they forced my wife to place her hands behind her back. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting off circulation to her fingers. She was shaking from cold and pain, her body trying to bring our child into the world while being treated like a criminal. That was when Sarah collapsed. The hospital emergency room was a blur of activity and antiseptic smells. Sarah was rushed into a delivery room while I sat in the waiting area, still processing what had happened. The fake officers had finally realized the severity of the situation when Sarah lost consciousness in the snow. They had called an ambulance and then disappeared into the night, leaving me to explain to real paramedics why my pregnant wife was wearing handcuffs during a medical emergency. Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending physician, came out to speak with me 3 hours later. Her expression was serious but not panicked, which gave me hope. "Your wife is stable," she said, sitting down beside me. "The baby is healthy and will be born within the next few hours. However, I need to understand what happened before the ambulance arrived." I told her everything. About the fake officers, the illegal detention, the handcuffs in the snow. She listened with growing disbelief, taking notes on a clipboard. "This is beyond unacceptable," she said when I finished. What those men did could have caused serious harm to both your wife and your baby. I am required to report this incident to the authorities." "I would appreciate that," I said, though I knew my own report would carry more weight than hers. After Dr. Chen left, I stepped outside to make the phone calls that would change everything. My first call was to Deputy Director James Walsh, my most trusted colleague at Homeland Security. "Jim, I need a favor," I said, walking to a quiet corner of the hospital parking lot. "I need you to run background checks on some individuals who impersonated police officers tonight." "Mike, are you okay? Where are you calling from?" "St. Mary's Hospital. Someone decided to play cop with my pregnant wife during a medical emergency." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jim had worked with me for 8 years. He knew that I did not exaggerate threats or ask for personal favors lightly. "Send me their names and I will have complete files within the hour," he said. "Do you need federal agents on scene?" "Not yet, but I want everything documented. Every financial record, every social media post, every parking ticket. When I move against these people, I want it to be overwhelming." My second call was to Amanda Rivera, the best federal prosecutor in the Eastern District. She had successfully prosecuted corrupt officials, organized crime figures, and domestic terrorists. Suburban vigilantes would be easy work for her. "Amanda, I need to discuss a case involving impersonation of federal officers," I said. "Federal officers? Mike, what happened?" I gave her the basic details, focusing on the legal violations rather than the personal trauma. Amanda listened without interruption, her legal mind already processing the potential charges. "This is a solid federal case," she said when I finished. "Impersonating law enforcement officers, conspiracy, assault on a pregnant woman, false imprisonment. We are talking about decades in prison for each participant. I want to make sure we have an airtight case before we move," I said. "These people think they can abuse their neighbors with fake authority. I want to make an example that will prevent this from ever happening again." While I was making these calls, the fake officers were making their own moves. I learned later that they had filed false police reports, claiming that Sarah and I had been aggressive and non-compliant during a routine security check. They described me as hostile and Sarah as hysterical, painting themselves as professional officers dealing with difficult subjects. Harold Brennan, the HOA president, had called an emergency board meeting for the next morning. The agenda included a discussion of security protocols and dealing with uncooperative residents. They were planning to double down on their illegal activities instead of backing down. The HOA's legal team had also been activated. They sent a letter to the hospital threatening to sue for defamation if anyone spoke publicly about the incident. They claimed that their security patrol had acted within their authority and that any criticism of their actions would be considered harassment. They had no idea that they were threatening the family of a federal law enforcement official. They had no idea that every move they made was being documented and analyzed by people who prosecute threats against national security. My phone rang with a text message from Jim. "Background checks complete. You are not going to believe what we found." I was about to discover that the fake officers had more secrets than just counterfeit badges. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. By 9:45, I was sitting in the community center conference room, watching Harold Brennan shuffle through papers and whisper with the other board members. They kept glancing at me nervously, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. I had not slept in 36 hours. Sarah had given birth to our healthy daughter at 4 in the morning, and I had spent the rest of the night reviewing the background files that Jim had sent me. The fake officers had criminal histories, financial problems, and social media posts that revealed their true motivations for playing cop. "Mike, we appreciate you coming to discuss the incident," Harold began, his voice trying to sound conciliatory. "We want to make sure there are no misunderstandings about our security protocols." "There are no misunderstandings," I said calmly. "Your fake officers detained my pregnant wife during a medical emergency. They handcuffed her in a blizzard while she was in active labor. What I want to understand is how you authorized this behavior." Board member Janet Mills, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mike, we created the security patrol to keep everyone safe during emergencies. We never intended for anyone to be hurt." "But you did authorize residents to impersonate police officers," I said, pulling out my phone to record the conversation. "You gave them badges, uniforms, and authority to detain other residents." "They are certified security professionals," Harold protested. "They completed training courses and background checks." "Online courses," I corrected. 24-hour programs that anyone can pass with a credit card, and the background checks were performed by the same company that sold them the fake badges. The room fell silent. I could see the board members exchanging worried glances, finally beginning to understand the legal implications of what they had done. "Gentlemen, ladies, I think it is time for complete honesty," I said, standing up and walking to the front of the room. "You have created an illegal security force that impersonates law enforcement officers. You have given them authority to detain residents without legal basis. And last night, they committed multiple federal crimes against my family." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my federal credentials, placing them on the table in front of Harold. The gold badge and identification card gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "My name is Michael Harrison, and I am the Director of Homeland Security for the Northeastern region. I oversee federal law enforcement operations in 6 states, and you have just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The color drained from Harold's face as he stared at my credentials. Janet Mills gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The other board members sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of their situation. "You are federal law enforcement," Harold whispered. "I am federal law enforcement," I confirmed. "And your fake officers committed assault, false imprisonment, and impersonation of federal officers against my family. These are crimes that carry sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison." My phone rang at exactly that moment. It was Jim, calling right on schedule. "Mike, the federal task force is in position," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "We have search warrants for all participants in the fake police operation. Should we proceed with arrests?" "Give me 10 more minutes," I said, watching the board members squirm in their seats. "I want to see if anyone wants to cooperate before we move to the next phase." I hung up and looked around the room. These people had spent years bullying their neighbors with petty violations and threatening letters. They had created a climate of fear and intimidation that made residents afraid to challenge their authority. Now they were about to learn what real authority looked like. "Here is what is going to happen," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Federal agents are going to arrest your fake officers within the hour. They will be charged with multiple federal crimes and will likely spend the next 2 decades in prison. The HOA will be dissolved, and its assets seized as part of the criminal investigation." Harold found his voice. "Mike, we can work this out. We never meant for anyone to be hurt." "You meant to intimidate and control your neighbors," I replied. "You created fake cops to enforce your will through fear and violence. The fact that you hurt my family in the process just means you will face federal charges instead of local ones." Janet Mills started crying. "We were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to keep the neighborhood under your control. There is a difference." My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Rivera. "Indictments ready. Federal marshals standing by." I looked at my watch. It was exactly 10:30. "Time is up," I announced. The federal marshals arrived at 11:15, their black SUVs rolling through the neighborhood like a small army. I watched from my front window as they executed simultaneous arrests at 3 different houses, including the fake officers Martinez and Thompson. The perp walk was everything I had hoped it would be. Martinez, whose real name was Robert Chen, was led out of his house in handcuffs while his neighbors watched in shock. He was not a certified security professional. He was an unemployed construction worker who had been fired from his last job for showing up drunk. His fake police uniform was hanging in his closet next to a collection of military surplus gear he had never earned the right to wear. Thompson, actually named David Kim, was arrested at his workplace. He was a part-time delivery driver who had convinced the HOA board he was a former police officer. In reality, he had been rejected by 3 different police academies and had a criminal record that included assault and fraud charges. His fake badge was sitting on his kitchen table next to a stack of unpaid bills and collection notices. The third arrest was Harold Brennan himself. Federal agents had discovered that he had been embezzling HOA funds for 2 years, using the money to pay for vacations and home improvements. The fake security patrol was partly designed to intimidate residents who might ask questions about the missing money. Social media exploded within hours. Videos of the arrests were posted on neighborhood Facebook groups, Twitter, and local news websites. The story spread rapidly. Federal officials' pregnant wife assaulted by fake HOA cops. National news outlets picked up the story, and by evening it was trending on multiple platforms. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from reporters, but I referred all media inquiries to the federal prosecutor's office. This was not about publicity. This was about justice. The real revelation came when federal forensic accountants began examining the HOA's financial records. Harold had not been the only one stealing money. Board member Janet Mills had been falsifying maintenance invoices and pocketing the difference. Treasurer Mark Walsh had been charging residents for services that were never provided. The entire HOA leadership was a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association. They had been systematically defrauding residents for years, using intimidation and fake authority to prevent anyone from questioning their activities. More victims came forward as the investigation expanded. Mrs. Alina Rodriguez, an elderly widow, had been harassed by the fake officers for months. They had threatened to fine her for minor landscaping violations while demanding cash payments that went directly into their pockets. Young couple David and Michelle Torres had been told their children were too noisy and faced eviction if they did not pay special noise violation fees. The fake officers had made multiple late-night visits to their home, wearing their counterfeit uniforms and making threats. Single mother Jennifer Adams had been targeted for harassment after she complained about missing maintenance funds. The fake officers had followed her to work, photographed her license plate, and told her neighbors she was under investigation for criminal activity. The pattern was clear and systematic. The The fake officers had been operating an extortion scheme, using their counterfeit authority to intimidate residents into paying illegal fees and fines. Anyone who questioned their authority was subjected to escalating harassment until they either paid or moved away. Federal prosecutors filed charges against 7 people in total. The fake officers faced federal charges for impersonating law enforcement officers, assault, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. The HOA board members faced additional charges for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The local police department launched their own investigation into why they had never been notified about the fake officers. They discovered that Harold Brennan had been calling the police dispatcher regularly, claiming to be coordinating with law enforcement on neighborhood security issues. The dispatcher had assumed the calls were legitimate and had never verified the identity of the callers. The neighborhood began to change immediately. Residents who had been afraid to speak out for years suddenly found their voices. They organized their own meetings, shared their stories, and began the process of creating a legitimate homeowners association with proper oversight and transparency. My daughter was born healthy and strong, despite the trauma her mother had endured. Sarah recovered quickly from the delivery, but the emotional scars took longer to heal. She had nightmares about the handcuffs and the cold snow for weeks after the incident. The first court hearings were scheduled for the following month. The fake officers would face a federal judge who had spent 30 years prosecuting corruption and abuse of power. They would learn the difference between real justice and the fake authority they had wielded over their neighbors. The federal courthouse in downtown was packed on the day of sentencing. I sat in the front row with Sarah and our 3-month-old daughter Emma, watching as the fake officers were led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuits and shackles. Judge Patricia Holloway had a reputation for being tough on corruption cases. She had sentenced corrupt mayors, fraudulent contractors, and abusive police officers to lengthy prison terms. She did not tolerate people who abused positions of authority, even fake ones. Robert Chen, you have been convicted of impersonating a federal officer, assault on a pregnant woman, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Judge Holloway began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. These crimes strike at the heart of our justice system and our civil society. Chen stood before the judge, his lawyer beside him making one final plea for leniency. He had lost weight during his months in federal custody, and his cocky demeanor had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone who finally understood the consequences of his actions. Your Honor, my client was misled by the HOA leadership, his lawyer argued. He believed he was acting within his authority as a legitimate security officer. Judge Holloway was not impressed. Mr. Chen purchased a fake badge on the internet and decided to play police officer in his neighborhood. He handcuffed a pregnant woman in a blizzard while she was in active labor. There is no excuse for this behavior. The sentence was 22 years in federal prison. David Kim received 20 years for the same charges. His lawyer had tried to argue that he was following Chen's lead, but federal investigators had discovered that Kim had been the one who suggested using handcuffs on Sarah. He had escalated the violence deliberately. Harold Brennan, the former HOA president, received 15 years for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. The federal investigation had uncovered over $200,000 in stolen HOA funds, money that had been taken from residents through fake fines and inflated maintenance fees. The other HOA board members received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement in the criminal enterprise. Janet Mills, who had seemed like a sweet retired teacher, had actually been one of the masterminds behind the financial fraud scheme. The civil lawsuits began immediately after the criminal sentences were announced. Sarah and I filed suit against the HOA, the fake officers, and the equipment company that had sold them counterfeit badges. We were awarded $3 million in damages, money that would secure Emma's future and help other victims of the fake police scheme. More importantly, the case became a national example of how homeowners associations could be corrupted and abused. Federal legislation was introduced to regulate HOA security forces and require real background checks for anyone given authority over residents. Our neighborhood transformed completely. The old HOA was dissolved and replaced with a resident-led organization focused on genuine community improvement rather than control and intimidation. The new leadership was transparent, accountable, and focused on serving residents rather than ruling them. I decided to remain in the neighborhood, partly because I loved our house and partly because I wanted to ensure that this kind of abuse never happened again. My federal position was no longer a secret, but that actually made the community safer. Everyone knew that genuine law enforcement was just a phone call away. Emma is now 2 years old, and she plays in the same streets where her mother was handcuffed by fake cops. The difference is that those streets are now safe from the kind of petty tyrants who had terrorized residents for years. The fake officers will be in federal prison until Emma is old enough to graduate from college. Their counterfeit badges are now evidence in a federal crime museum, reminders of what happens when people try to create authority they have never earned. Justice was served, completely and thoroughly, and our neighborhood learned that real authority comes from service and protection, not from intimidation and fake credentials. Sometimes the good guys really do win.